this is the first conversation I've had. I haven't even asked you about this. What do you think about it? But like, I'm viewing this as we'll get as far as we get. If we run to the end of an hour and there's a ton more to say, it'll just have more parts because this is not a thing I want to rush or not
That's
take
fine.
seriously. And I want you to jump in at any point where it
Yep.
seems like either I've talked too much or something isn't clear. So, real quick background about the relationship between God and morality. So, we've talked about having a little series of episodes that we pick up every now and then, maybe when there's a lull or something between interviews. Maybe we call it the Philosophy 101 series or something like that.
Hmm.
I don't know. You could consider this like part one of that if we want. But this would be like if you were to take my intro philosophy class, these are the sorts of things we would talk about. And one of the things we've talked about having a little mini series of episodes about is ethics. And so I want to eventually have an entire episode just about God and morality because it's really interesting Christian ethics versus secular
And we'll have a
ethics.
Christian ethicist on soon,
Yes.
David Gushee.
Yeah, oh, yes. Excellent. So definitely we're going to talk more about this. So this is like a very cursory 30,000-foot view of this topic, God and morality, just because it's kind of important background information. So to raise what's called the problem of evil at all, to say that there's suffering in the world and it constitutes some kind of problem for theism is to already to see a conflict between God and evil is to make moral judgments about the state of the world and to make moral judgments about God. And that implies a few things that might not be immediately obvious. One, it implies that God can be the subject of moral criticism, which is kind of controversial among certain theological systems. It implies, for example, that a really famous and really old and really influential Christian theory of ethics is false. And that theory is called variously divine command theory or theological voluntarism, whatever you want to call it. It's this view that morality is rooted in God's nature or in God's will, more specifically, so that whatever God commands is what is good or right.
Hmm.
Those principles just are constituted by God's commands or God's will. And if that's the case, then anything God commands is good and anything God forbids is bad. And that's just the meaning of moral terms. That's called divine command theory. If it makes any sense at all to put God under a kind of moral microscope, then that view is automatically wrongheaded. We're automatically like disregarding an enormous swath of theological history there. So I just want to make that plain. To raise
Which,
this problem is to kind of take a stand on that
yeah,
view.
which I feel like too few people with who either hold that view or who even just try to broach this topic don't see a difference between God, like
Yeah.
who the divine life, and our concept of God.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're talking about our concept of God, then we should really hold that under the microscope and apply this conversation to it. When you talk about God, all of morality flows from God and all this stuff. I would agree with that, but we don't have a clear pick. We don't have this. Here's the Bible and it's perfect and pure and
Mm-hmm.
all our questions are answered. And the Bible doesn't work like that.
No, nothing in theology works like that. Yeah, so we're definitely going to have a whole other episode talking about this. I just wanted to make that plain at the beginning. Even raising the question implies some interesting things
Okay.
theologically. Another thing it might imply, this isn't entailed, but I think it's implied, is that if it's possible to mount a moral critique of God, you might need to do that using non theological sources or non religious sources, which raises the possibility that a lot of Christian apologists and Christian ethicists don't like, which is that you could ground an ethic in something else that
Mm-hmm.
secular ethics might be better or at least just as good. And that is, in fact, my own view, which I want to talk about at a later date. And then another thing we're implying here by raising the problem is that the world could be better than it is. And maybe that's obvious, but a lot of theologians and philosophers have denied that. So, one type of theodicy, which we'll talk about later, is that that's not the case, that this is the best world. And that's a way to get out of the problem, right? You say, well, this is the best God could have done. I'm not satisfied by that at all. I think it's
No.
very obvious that it could be better. So if you agree that suffering is a problem, you're taking that view. And then one more piece of background information, and that is about how intuitions work in
Mm-hmm.
this conversation. They're unavoidable in my view, intuitions. And you can think of intuitions as kind of like judgments about states of affairs in the world that are kind of theoretical, not really fleshed out, not really super deeply considered. Something strikes you as being true
Mhm.
about this, and we all have them. And interestingly, they differ, and they differ in sometimes predictable ways. And there's a whole field of philosophy that's interested in how they differ and whether or not we can trust them. But when we talk about things like, take instance of suffering X, some people will look at X and immediately feel that's obviously wrong. Other people might look at X and feel it's wrong in some situations and not others. Others might think it's just good. And so when philosophers are fishing for examples to talk about evil, this is one of the reasons they often go to extremes, because they want everyone's intuition to be really strong.
Hmm.
And so they'll use cases like Hitler, because
Mhm.
everybody has a really strong intuition that we're all really sure about. And intuitions are the things we're trying to explain when we do ethics. That's one of the things we're trying to explain. So I'm not apologizing that I'm going to be relying on intuitions here. I just want to note it because it's unavoidable in my view. That would make some philosophers mad, by the way, what I just said. So just note that. Okay. The problem. What is it? So when I broach this problem with my students, we've already had a whole section prior to this about what God means, which is a whole nother thing that would take a long time to go through. But one of the things I tell them is that try to, when considering this problem, if it's possible, I know it's hard, but try to take all the things you have convictions about from your religious practices or your faith and try to bracket those just for the purposes of the conversation. And instead of thinking of God as a person or as a name of a being that you've had interactions with and that you think think of God as a title that may or may not be held by something. And what would be included in that title? This is a way of trying to think about the problem rationally, trying to put a little bit of emotional distance between
Mhm.
you and the issue.
Mhm.
And again, I hesitate to even say that, but it's important for doing philosophical thinking clearly in
Yeah,
most
I think so.
cases. And so, if we think of God as a title rather than a name, and we ask what would it take to have that, there are certain attributes or characteristics or features that go along with the title or the idea of what a God would be. And most of these attributes, or there's a set of them that have been very persuasive to most of the people who have thought about it, at least in the West, but not just in the West. So you've heard of things like the omni attributes, right? Omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, omnitemporality, omnipresence, all those omnis just means that anything that held the title of God would have these certain features to their maximal degree, because that's just kind of what we mean by God, right? As Anselm put it back in the 12th century or whatever, God is the greatest thing, the greatest conceivable thing. If you could think of something greater, then the first thing you thought of wasn't God.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
need God has all the attributes that make a thing great. That's the title. And then the question is there anything like that? And so before my students ever get to the problem of evil, we've talked extensively about that. We've talked extensively about each of those attributes, what they are, what they entail, what they don't entail. And we have a really clear idea of what God is. I'm not going to bore you with all that going into this, but just
Thank you.
try to separate, if you can, your religious convictions about God from the kinds of traits that you think a God must have.
Sure.
And the important traits that we're going to be focused on here are three things: one, knowledge; two, power; and three, goodness.
Yep.
That third one's really important. The combination of those three things with a fourth thing, which is the fact of suffering, creates the problem of evil.
Yes.
So you could think of it as an inconsistent set of claims. There is a being who has the knowledge to eradicate evil. That being also has the power to eradicate evil, and that being wants to eradicate evil. In other words, that being is good. And number four, evil exists.
Mhm.
Those four things are inconsistent, or at least they seem inconsistent on the
Mhm.
face of it.
Mhm.
And so the challenge to the theist is to explain how those things can possibly be consistent. That is, in essence, the oldest form of the problem of evil. We'll talk more about that specific form in a few moments. Another part of the setup that's important to note, I think, is that this is an incredibly persuasive argument to a lot of people against theism, so much so that it's really, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it's almost the only argument against theism that gets any real focus.
Hmm.
And one reason for that is that a lot of people just think it's enough. It's sufficient. It's decisive all by itself. It has various versions. We can talk about some of those versions. There's another related problem called the problem of hiddenness, which is, why does God seem so hidden?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't more people find their way to belief in God? But I think that's really kind of a version of the problem of evil, because it's a kind of suffering to want to be in relationship with God and find that blocked in
Mm-hmm.
some way.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of versions of it, but there aren't really any other objections to theism that get a lot of philosophical attention.
Hmm.
This is it.
Interesting.
And a lot of philosophers think it's enough. So that's just worth noting. Okay. Should we pause? Should we plow on? Any?
I think so.
Okay.
That was good.
Okay, good.
Important things to cite. Yep.
Good. Okay, so there's two primary well, there's more than two, but I'm going to talk about two versions of the problem of evil. The one I just gave you about four inconsistent sets of claims, that goes all the way back to Greek philosophy. So Epicurus gave a really famous version of that. It was more or less the way I put it. If there's a being who knows how to stop evil, can stop evil, wants to stop evil, there shouldn't be any evil, but we look around and there's a whole lot of evil. So that's called the logical problem of evil, because it says there's a logical contradiction. There's an inconsistency between two facts.
Mm-hmm.
God exists, evil exists. They shouldn't.
What do you do with that? Yeah.
They shouldn't exist. And so the logical problem of evil is very strong. It says that God can't exist. That's the conclusion. If those four claims can't be true simultaneously, logically speaking, meaning it's impossible. There is, as the philosophers like to say, there's no possible world where God exists and evil exists. It just isn't a thing. And that was really influential. You had David Hume pushing something like that. I mean, it was convincing to a lot of philosophers for a long time. In the last 60, 70 years, it's been a lot less influential. I don't want to say it's been solved, but there's been a lot of philosophical work on it that have kind of ended discussion about it mostly, and attention has shifted to a different version of the problem. And just real crudely, one way to see why that discussion ended is to think of any theodicy that's really common and has convinced a lot of people, because all you really need to show that it's possible, logically possible, for God to exist alongside evil is some relatively convincing reason why God might have allowed evil. And that's
Free
what
will.
theodicies are,
Right.
right? Free will is a great example. And so we tell stories like the story of Adam and Eve in the garden that suggest that humans had some kind of role to play with respect to the kind of being God wanted them to be, which involved
Agency.
And so now suddenly we have a reason why an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God might have allowed the existence of evil.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason was some greater good.
Yep.
We're going to get to that later. And so that, you may or may not find that convincing, but it kind of does undermine that logical problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because the logical problem has gone out on a limb and made a really strong claim. This is impossible.
Yep.
All you got to do to overcome that is show that it's possible. And so philosophers kind of got bored with that. And
Okay.
they moved on to something else. And the thing they moved on to has various names. I'm going to call it the evidential problem of evil. And it's called that because it's kind of probabilistic, and its conclusion is not about what's possible. Its conclusion is about what we have good evidence to believe, what is reasonable, what is probable. And it argues that while it may be possible for God to exist alongside evil, the existence and the amount and the intensity and the variety of evil that we observe in the world makes it incredibly unlikely that a good, omniscient, omnipotent God could exist.
Which seems very similar to the logical argument to me.
Yeah, but with a crucial difference. It's not saying God can't exist, it's saying God almost certainly does not. You don't have good evidence that God exists. And in fact, you have overwhelming evidence that God does not exist. That's the conclusion. And that's a lot harder to combat.
But that's just specifically if we're talking about the problem of evil.
Yes.
Because I think that conversation is much broader than just the problem of evil. As far as evidentially,
What do you mean?
Let's cut this out if I sound too stupid.
Okay. Deal.
Existence itself could be, I would think, philosophically, certainly theologically, some sort of evidence that God exists.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So you're thinking like a cosmological argument or something like that?
Cosmological or consciousness
Mm-hmm.
is kind of
Yeah.
evidence that perhaps there's something
Yes.
greater than us. I
Yeah.
think you could go down the line with some of these things.
Yeah. That old canard, why is there something rather than nothing? A lot of serious philosophers have thought that implies some kind of theism. Yes. Okay. So I would view that as interestingly when we do this in class, we've also previously had a unit on God's existence, and we've gone through all these arguments: the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, a bunch of others. And so we have like this weight of evidence on the side of theism coming from all these different strands of evidence. Like, for example, that anything exists at all, that might be a kind of evidence, or that things developed from a finite point in the past, that might be a form of evidence. Some started it.
Mm-hmm,
There was a
mm-hmm.
cause. That anything has an explanation at all. If the whole ball of wax has an explanation, what could possibly explain it? It can't be part of
Or
the
morals
nature
in
itself.
general could
Yeah,
be evidence.
exactly. Maybe morality itself points to a law of some kind. And if there's a law, maybe there needs to be someone who set the
Source
law.
of it, yeah.
Exactly. So we've already gone through in class, all those reasons.
Sorry for rewinding back.
No, that's fine. This is a good point. And so what I like to tell the students is, look, we just went through 12 or whatever it is arguments for God's existence. Theists have given a bunch of them, and then on the other side of the scales, we have one argument, which is the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have hard data on this. I don't know like where the majority opinion falls, but it is not clear to me that the scales tip in the direction of theism. If you're just talking about general opinion of specialists in this field, that one might be enough
That's fair.
to counterbalance all. So that's kind of how I think about it. The problem of evil doesn't undercut those kinds of evidence. They're still real kinds of evidence. It just gives you another kind of evidence that is maybe weightier or maybe a little more sure. Because when we're talking about things like, the beginning of the universe, our intuitions about that get pretty thin.
Mm-hmm.
Mine do,
Mm-hmm.
anyway. I don't have real clear intuitions about how the Big Bang and God relate to each other. I have opinions, but at the end of the day, they're based on something pretty flimsy that I barely understand. But I have real strong intuitions about suffering and about the goodness of God.
Okay.
And so that tends to be experienced as a little more weighty.
Or authoritative.
Yes, that's a good word for it. Yes. So the evidential problem, let me give you an example of it from the philosophical literature. And this is hopefully a palatable example for most people, but it's still a little bit difficult, especially if you're like really sensitive about animal suffering. So fair warning. So a guy named Bill Rowe was an atheistic philosopher of religion, called himself a friendly atheist because he tried really
Like
hard.
compassionate
Yes,
conservatism.
kind of.
Sorry.
Yeah. But he did really try hard to understand theism and the arguments from its strongest proponents, and took it really seriously, and was never dismissive or condescending or anything like that, which is fairly
I
unusual
don't
for
believe you.
atheists in recent years. So he was really good at it. And so he mounted a version of the evidential problem of evil, and he used an example that I always use in class, and it involves a deer, okay, a fawn, like Bambi.
Why'd you
Okay?
gotta go here?
I know. I gave you fair warning. And so he says, imagine a fawn gets separated from its mother, and freak lightning strike starts a brush fire, and familiar to all of us these days, you suddenly have a raging wildfire, and Bambi gets caught up in the wildfire. But maybe it's just on the edge of the wildfire, so Bambi is not immediately killed. Bambi is severely burned, and it takes, let's say, days for Bambi to die in agony.
I don't like calling this
Okay.
deer Bambi. Okay. But go on.
Yeah. I know this sounds a little flippant, but I actually do think that this is a serious problem. And so Bill Rowe says that kind of suffering clearly happens, right?
Yeah.
It's probably happening somewhere now. Some version of that is happening somewhere now with all the wildfires that are raging
In many places in the world. Yeah.
Yes. And here's the thing about that kind of suffering: no one ever knows about it.
Mm-hmm.
No one finds out. Nothing good comes from it. At least it's very hard to see what could come from it, right? Because there isn't any entity that could learn from it. There isn't any It doesn't ever get better for Bambi. It doesn't ever get better for Bambi's parents. It doesn't ever get better for the environmentalists who care about that problem in general, but don't have any actual awareness of that specific case. It's just real hard to locate any reason for that. Anything that could seem like if I was a good person who had power over the situation, I would still let that happen to bring about end X. What could X possibly be? It's hard to say. And the ease of coming up with examples like that should give you pause. The world is full of instances of suffering that don't seem to have any purpose at all. And Bill Rowe called them gratuitous. That was the word he used. And gratuitous just means unnecessarily bad or arbitrary, reasonless, purposeless. And while it may be the case that, and we're going to see this and when we talk about more of the theodicies in a minute, it may be the case that God might have some reasons for allowing some suffering, right? It's easy to think of examples of hardship that make one more resilient or that build your character, right? In class, I like to use the example of like breakups. Right?
Sure.
We all had difficult breakups as adolescents. And at least in my case, I think they made me better, right? They made me more mature. Or we all make stupid decisions and we suffer the consequences and we learn from them and we become better people, such that we can look back at them and say, I'm actually glad that happened. It was awful in the moment. It was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but I'd be a worse person if it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, God could make a really good world and put some suffering in it. Maybe even great suffering that at the time it's experienced seems like the worst thing ever. But what God can't do is have arbitrary suffering, suffering that leads to no purpose, leads to nothing good. It can't be gratuitous suffering. And so Bill Rowe said, but there is. It's everywhere. It's not hard to think of examples of it, including examples involving humans and innocent humans. And so, what what is the evidential, situation with respect to God's existence? How likely is it that a good God with all the power and all the knowledge to prevent gratuitous suffering exists when we see so much of it? So that's the evidential problem. His argument was we have tons of evidence. Just look around that the Christian God, for example, can't exist. That's hard. That's hard to deal with. And it works for lots of different types of evil. I
Now,
just gave you an example of natural evil, right?
yeah.
Something nobody's fault, because like one common theodicy is free will, which we just mentioned, and that says evil is the result of human decisions. God wanted something really good, and that good thing was a relationship with humans. And in order to have a real relationship with somebody, it's got to be two ways, which means there has to be a choice on the other end. God couldn't have just made robots. So God gave us a will. And that carries with it a kind of risk. This is how the free will theodicy goes. And so God took that risk, knowing that the end was going to be so great that it would justify whatever might have gone wrong in giving us that gift. And so we can explain a lot of the evil in the world by humans abusing that gift. That's probably the most popular theological response to evil, Augustine, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't touch Bambi, right? Because nobody chose that. It was
Well,
just a bolt of lightning.
except for the belief that Adam's curse goes into nature, and
Yeah.
Apostle Paul saying in Romans 8 that all of creation is
Yeah.
crying in birth, in childbirth, longing for the
Mhm.
sons of God to be revealed. I'm stumbling over my words because I wasn't thinking of it, but I think there's a way for us to understand that in a Christian way that actually
Yep.
doesn't make that the like Bambi isn't the unsolvable
Mhm.
problem.
Yes, but we're going to see this with every theodicy we're going to talk about. Is my refrain at the end of it is going to be, but what does the evidence tell us? What do we actually have good reason to believe? And personally, speaking for me,
Mm-hmm.
it's very difficult for me to see any convincing case that something like that is true.
Mm-hmm.
And in what way that would justify a particular instance of suffering that I'm looking at right now. And it would still remain the case that surely God could have thought of a better way to do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't we have had a world where there's like 3 less deer that die in wildfires? That would be better. It's just obnoxiously easy to think of states of affairs that would be better than this one. So I don't find solutions like that convincing, but we'll give them their fair
That's
shake
fine.
in a minute.
Yep.
I think I cut you off earlier. I don't know.
No, it's fine. No.
Okay. So this is why when we talked to Keith DeRose, if you haven't heard that episode, go back and check it out. Probably the most focus we've had on the problem of evil before this.
Mm-hmm.
He called the problem of evil a killer problem.
Yes.
He's somebody who specializes in it. And what he meant was, um, if you don't have an answer to this, you should not be a Christian.
Yes.
You shouldn't be a theist of any kind. If you don't at least think that there's a possible answer to this, or that you have some kind of hope for a resolution to this, it just doesn't make a lot of rational sense to continue doing it.
Yeah.
It's a killer.
I would agree with that.
It stops the faith. Um, yeah, and I think we're kind of both in agreement with him about that. So for that reason, some kind of response seems required, and those responses are called theodicies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why they're called that, but it's an old term that
Not going
philosophers
to go
know.
into the etymology of the word.
So there's a bunch of these, and I've got a list here we can talk about. I'm curious from you, maybe before I go through the list, in your experience as a pastor, what kinds of theodicies do you typically see used the most? What do you is there like a way that pastors tend to approach explaining suffering to their congregations that you think is, I don't know, especially good or maybe especially bad, especially common?
I don't like this question, or like, I don't like this because I have pastor friends who listen, and I don't want any of them to feel like I'm
Yeah.
talking about them. But you guys tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like, first of all, there's not many pastoral attempts to solve the problem of evil. We kind of just assume that God is good, and we ignore all the ugliness of the world. And then we can, I mean, there's a whole range, right? I mean, Pat Robertson said that the earthquake
Mm-hmm.
in Haiti happened. I don't know when that was, 2011 or something like that, because of all the voodoo that happened. Or,
Yeah.
pastors have said that Hurricane Katrina happened because of all the ungodliness happening in New Orleans. The tornado that touched down at the ELCA convention, when they were talking about whether to ordain gay clergy, happened because of the gays. You can go on
Mm-hmm.
and on, and pastors and church leaders have explained away natural disasters in particular, but atrocities and evil and disaster on human sin, right? So that's one way that pastors and faith leaders have tried to solve this problem, is just like,
Mm-hmm.
it's our fault, it's your fault, it's those sinners' fault. It's usually not our fault, it's their fault.
Right.
That's one way. Another one is just this kind of, and I don't know how much we think through this stuff, but what I mentioned at the beginning of our time, which is just this sovereignty of God.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
God is in control, God is sovereign, and it's our job to trust him. I think that's probably the most common one, even in non-Calvinistic,
Yeah.
non-reformed traditions. We're almost not we many churches or Christians that even don't claim to be reformed functionally, you know uh conversationally come across as reformed, because they will say those things. Well, I don't know why that happened, but God's in control, I trust God.
Yeah, you just wrap it all up in it's the eternal perspective, right?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Like we live in a fallen world, and so you just grin and bear it. And like later on, it's all going to be worth it. You kind of just gloss over this part that's less significant than whatever's to come.
Yeah, which is kind of what I do when I'm going to explain what I believe in my like layman's theodicy. It is like there's something better to come, or that God's going to make all things right at the end. I trust that, and I believe it, and I think there's a place for that. I don't think that's inherently bad, but it's not like evidential, like
Yeah.
you keep on hitting at. And I'm going to tell you, through, no matter how many times you say that, that's not the end of the conversation for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want it to be either.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even what would evidence of the fall look like if not the world around us,
Mm-hmm.
which is obviously broken. Like
Yeah.
I don't know how else you could pursue that track.
Yeah, so the evidence that I'm mostly concerned with here is there sufficient evidence for any of these theodicies that we're about to go through to counterbalance the vast, pervasive evidence of suffering around us and its inconsistency with a good God? That's going to be the question. Do we have enough to kind of outweigh or to give us good reason to hope that maybe we're just mistaken about this? Because that's really what we have to conclude if we're going to continue being religious in the face of the problem of evil. We got to just be mistaken in some way about how things seem to us. That's part of the power of the problem.
But isn't the idea that like the world is broken? It's
Mhm.
like we all acknowledge that. So there is suffering. Bambi suffers a long, painful death, but God is putting all of the pieces back
Mhm.
together. It's just not.
Yes.
It's not together again yet.
Yes.
And that's the part of this conversation that might be missing in philosophical circles is I'm a person of faith because I choose to be a person of faith rather than not. I
Mhm.
think that's a better way to live in many ways. I'm a person of faith because I choose to be a person who is fueled by hope for what could be rather than just what is, and accepting that.
Mhm.
And that's not evidential based. That's not, that's
Right.
it's a whole nother conversation, but I think it's important to hold on to when we're having these conversations.
Yes, that's fair. And I think we've talked before about the difference between being an irrationalist and a kind of, I don't know, someone who thinks that faith happens when reason has run its course. When we
Mm.
talked about Kierkegaard, we talked about this. Because I can be somebody who thinks that the evidence is ultimately indecisive. In fact, that is my view about evil.
Mhm.
Just laying my cards on the table. But um, in a case like that, I think it's totally reasonable to then pick an option that has some other benefit outside of epistemic benefits.
Yes.
In other words, it's not superior in terms of what any person can know, and it's not superior evidentially, but it does have some psychological benefits, maybe, or it has some emotional benefits. It might be good for my overall mental health. It might be good communally. It might help me to build a really healthy
I
community
was
that
going to say it
does.
might be better for the world and the
Yes,
earth.
exactly. It might help. Yes, exactly. So that's reasonable. But that's different from being an irrationalist, which is to work against the evidence. And what we've got here in the evidential form of the problem of evil is a strong challenge
Mhm.
for the theist or the religious person to show how they're not being irrational and continuing to be religious because they're surrounded by evidence that God shouldn't exist.
Mhm.
And so what we have to give is something that gets us back, not necessarily that tips the scales back and towards the direction of theism being the reasonable option, but just not being unreasonable. Like
Yes.
we're just trying to reach an equilibrium here again.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So I love asking people how they deal with the problem after it's been formulated. I do this with my students because you always, in a class full of 20 students, you get most of the historical theodicies. They just come out
Yep.
of your intuitions.
Yep.
Because they're just the most obvious ways of trying to deal with the problem. You always get free will. You always get some version of things are going to be better eventually.
Afterlife.
Yeah, so much better that it will in some way account for and justify how bad they were before. So I like to call this the tapestry theodicy because I've heard it used in that kind of metaphor of God is weaving a grand tapestry of life. And, if you look at a beautiful tapestry, I show my students a picture of a tapestry from the front side and then another picture of the same tapestry from the back side. And the front side is beautiful and the back side is marred and ugly and it has loose strands and everything. And so the problem, of course, is that we don't see the whole picture. We've got a very narrow focus. And if we could see things from God's perspective, all the bits that seem terrible would have their place. And of course, if you didn't have contrast, you couldn't have a beautiful work of art. And so what God sees is the whole and how each instance of evil plays a part in that.
Problem solved. Episode over.
Right. But, I say this, I try not to be flippant about it, but like,
I like that actually.
I don't find anything convincing about that. I think you have to be remarkably privileged, as a matter of fact, to find that satisfying all by itself. And yet, I'm not kidding here, some of the greatest minds who have ever lived, people like Gottfried Leibniz, who discovered calculus and was just intimidatingly brilliant, took that view. And then Voltaire made endless fun of him about it.
It's hard to know history and take that view.
Yeah, and yet these people did. They weren't dumb. They, read extremely widely, and yet.
But it's a fun, beautiful metaphor.
It is, yes, and in certain contexts, it can be really persuasive. I've heard it delivered in various forms in really persuasive ways by good orators who had the right kind of context and audience, and the music was playing just right, and it can seem really compelling.
So that's one kind of theodicy.
That's one kind of theodicy.
Give us some others.
Another is free will, which we've talked about. We don't have to say much more about that one. But it has obvious limits, right? Because there's only so much evil it can account for, unless you're willing to say things that I think are stretch the evidence to the breaking point. So, for example, Greg Boyd has a version of the free will theodicy that he calls a warfare theodicy. And he solves the problem of natural evil by saying it is still about free will. It's just demons.
That spiritual
Angels and
warfare is a
demons. It's
real thing.
spiritual warfare.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's their free will,
Which is a very like
that messed up nature.
ancient way of looking at it.
Yeah. Or we have some kind of real creative agency, and the choices we make impact nature in ways that we haven't quite taken account of. I don't want to say there's no, reasonable version of that, and he makes an extensive case for it, but I can't go there just because I don't have any evidence that there is any such thing.
Sure.
That I think is real good evidence anyway. Another really persuasive one, going back to Augustine again, is that this sounds silly when you say it, but it's a serious view. Evil doesn't really exist. Now that seems offensive almost, but Augustine's view is
I'm
that
intrigued.
Augustine's view is that evil isn't a thing. It's not an entity or a substance, as philosophers like to say. It doesn't have any properties. It's a privation.
What's that mean?
It's an absence. The only things that exist are good. And he had an argument for this. God is good. God couldn't produce anything that wasn't like God or of a piece with God's, ousia or whatever. And so anything God makes is by definition good. And so if anything seems bad, couldn't have come from God, and yet all things come from God. So where the hell could anything bad have come from? And his answer is people choose to be less than they could. And in failing that way, in failing to live up to God's intentions for them, they create states of affairs that are non-optimal, that are less good than they could have been. But there's not a thing called evil.
It's like when you turn off the lights.
Exactly.
What's left is darkness.
Exactly. Yes.
That's intriguing to me.
Yeah, it's a nice metaphysics for and this is like the standard view in like Roman Catholicism, for example. Evil isn't a substance; it's not an existing thing, and so it kind of, that plus free will gets God off the hook and does away with the problem of explaining where evil came from. Didn't come from anywhere because it isn't real.
But we know evil is real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like we know there are evil people.
Because lights are actually dark suckers.
Right. This runs into problems when you apply it to specific cases, like most of these theodicies do. It's very difficult to explain egregious, seemingly gratuitous pain, which is clearly a real thing, by saying, well, really, evil doesn't exist. Yeah, but this pain in that case existed, and it doesn't seem like there's a good reason for it. It didn't have to.
For me, I feel like that's a little bit easier to get around, but when you see evil personified is when I think it's harder to get around. Yeah. Hitler or Putin, or take your pick at all the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
When you see evil and you see what a person is capable of at their worst, then I feel like that theory goes out the window.
Yeah, and even at its best, I still don't think it can account for why there's this much of that kind of thing.
Sure.
God could have done better, unless you want to take that Leibniz view, and really this is the best one, which I don't. There's another one called soul building, is usually the way it's phrased. This goes back to a philosopher I really respect named John Hick. And he had this idea that, similar to free will in some ways, but a little bit different, God's interested in creating a kind of creature that God can be in relationship with. What God really wants to do is create something like himself or herself.
So the soul is evolving towards God.
Yes.
God-like state.
Evolution is a huge part of this view. In fact, Hick went back to the beginning of Genesis and the garden story and asked, is there really a fall in that? And came away with the conclusion that there isn't, and that the Augustinian view that saw a fall there was mistaken, and that in fact you don't have something created fully good that then fell and needs to somehow get back to its original position. What you have instead is a millions of years history of God trying to build a creature, apparently, and that there's necessarily a lot of hardship and suffering involved in that kind of thing.
Yes.
And we're like in the middle point.
Yeah.
Maybe not even close to the middle point of that process. This is Hick's view. And God is building a soul. And that soul is ultimately going to look very much like God's self, which, there's lots of theological precursors to this view.
Interesting to me.
Yeah.
But he's going to go all the way to like creating a human and then take millennia to figure out how to make it right.
But isn't that reflected in evolutionary law or theory?
But
Yeah. And it has a
Yeah,
lot of
it
nice
just feels
parenting
dumb.
analogies, though. Like, if I,
Yes.
and I'm just learning about being a parent because my kid is 2, but I want him to be a certain kind of person. And because of that, there's a limit on how much I can do, for him. Right. And there's a limit on how much help I can give.
100%.
And I have to set things up in such a way that there are boundaries. There's so far it can go before I stop it, but there's got to be a lot of play in there. And so Hicks views that we have a very limited perspective, and we're looking at this from evolutionary time scales, and we have no idea where this is headed. And you would expect there to be a lot of suffering that needs to be overcome as a part of it. So that's been kind of persuasive to some
I
people.
kind of like that because of what we know about. I would say not. I don't know what we know about it, but my understanding of the evolution of consciousness, right? Going back to like cavemen, and going all the way through in the tribalism and the all the isms, the misogyny and the racism and the ethnocentrism and all the wars that have been waged. And I would say that, and not I, but many have said that, like, human consciousness is evolving and we're getting better, and we're getting, like, I would say we're moving more towards new creation. There's less war than there's ever been. There's less, it's better to be a woman at any point in history than it is right now. It's better to be a person of color or a minority than at any point in history, even though it's really, really terrible to be a minority in some places, and it's really terrible to be an ethnic, marginalized person. But the fact is that for all these marginalized people groups, it's better to be alive right now than it was 100 years ago, and certainly 1,000 years ago, and certainly 2,000 years ago. You can go on and on. This has some flavor to me.
Yeah. Interestingly, one thing worth noting about that, and this takes us too far on a tangent, but that kind of point, which I totally resonate with and I get, I've only ever heard it made by white dudes.
Yeah, sure.
Including John Hick.
Yep.
Right. I've never heard a theodicy like this. There probably are, some that I'm just not familiar with, but these kinds of theodicies almost exclusively come from privileged thinkers. Now, you do have people like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, who quotes, I forget the theologian's name, about the arc of history bending toward justice. So there's obviously examples of it within.
I think that's fairly empirical, though.
Yeah, also data.
Exactly.
Well, yes, but this is a huge debate. There's a person I won't name because I don't want people writing to me, who wrote a book, who's kind of known for pushing this view. And he's very controversial because of it, and especially controversial among minority thinkers and feminist thinkers, for not taking seriously enough the ways that the problems are still really pervasive and pernicious, and how they could just go back the other direction at any point if we don't keep trying.
Absolutely, and we're seeing that right now. But I would think historians would say that's a consistent movement, which is 4 steps forward, 2 steps back, and it's continuing. It's not a straight line, basically.
So maybe it's all headed somewhere good. This is like a teleological kind of thing. Like, it's still that basic idea of there's a good greater than all the things we're experiencing that will eventually be achieved, that will justify all of this.
And we can look back and say we're headed we're better than it was. That's maybe the most compelling theodicy of
so people should absolutely read John Hick. He's worth reading, and his case for it is much more sophisticated than what I've delivered here, but I'm ultimately still unconvinced by it. I mean, it's not the kind of thing that confronting, it doesn't help me make sense of individual instances of suffering.
But the two things that are compelling to me, that make me want to look into it more, is the idea of the evolution of human consciousness, and also the evolution of all things, like that to me seems like two things running in parallel.
Yes. So I'll say this much. I definitely think any successful theodicy, or even reasonable theodicy, has to take our actual nature into account as organisms into account. It has to be evolutionary in some sense. It can't just be, I don't know, your typical Sunday school kind of thing where we were perfect and then we weren't perfect because of some choices we made, and all that we really need to get back to perfection is to make better choices. I mean, it just doesn't take seriously our nature at all, or how we've evolved.
Yeah. So as somebody who hasn't thought deeply about this, like, this is fun. Thank you. And also I'm curious, maybe this is a dumb question, but like, are these mutually exclusive?
No.
Do we have, because like atonement theory, like you kind of got to pick one.
That's interesting. I don't think you do, but that's
No,
I-
interesting.
I don't think
Yeah,
you
I get it though.
But there's like there's
Yeah.
things about them that are in contradiction to each other.
some that are worse than others, of course.
Yeah.
This, it feels like you could just kind of stack
Mhm.
them all, and is there this kind of multiplicative effect
Yes.
That's a
Good.
where
good-
you can
yeah.
start to weight them not on their own merits, but as it's like
Yes.
yes, and
Yes.
then this, and
I
then
think
this,
that's
and
right.
there's pretty soon there's a dump truck of them, right?
Yes, yes, and that's how theistic philosophers like to use arguments for God's existence too, because each one is only so strong on its own. But if you look at like 12 of them, and they're each independently interesting and calling attention to certain kinds of evidence that seem to have some weight on their own, put them all together, you might have a pretty good case, right? Something similar is true here. You could totally think free will is a part of the story. You could totally think soul building is a part of the story. You could totally think eschatology is part of the story. Like eventually we'll be so far removed from our suffering and in just perpetual bliss that it'll just be less important. That's another one I've heard. Another one that goes right along with that is fits nicely with this soul building thing is I don't know what to call it, but they talk a lot about natural laws and how just having physical laws working the way that they do entails a lot of suffering, but also a lot of beauty that wouldn't be possible without the suffering. So, for example, think about a mountain range and all of the things that had to happen tectonically for something like that to exist. Anything really beautiful in nature has a lot of suffering behind it, or at least the possibility for great suffering, right? I mean, earthquakes are an obvious example. There was just a major one that killed thousands of people.
Yeah, life usually comes from death.
Exactly. And yet without earthquakes, you don't have mountain ranges. And so that's another part of it that goes along with if God is trying to build a certain thing, maybe there are processes that are involved that entail great suffering on the way. But then you still have to ask yourself, that's what I keep coming back to, like, is that the only way God could have done it? Why wasn't there an option for an omnipotent being to have a process that achieved the same outcome?
Is there a substitute for redemption though?
What do you mean?
Well, something like you said earlier, art, like it's the contrast that makes it beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
If what we're headed for is redemption, if there's this beauty, if there's a restoration that happens, if somehow all of these things are made right, it's only the extent to which they were wrong. That creates the contrast. And if God is the one that then redeems all things, if it was just this kind of like incremental, like, yeah, he made it great in the first place, and then and now it's marginally better. Like that's not
right.
That's not as great as the story that I am like anticipating and hoping to be a part of.
Yeah, the payoff has to be unimaginable.
Yeah,
given the depth of the suffering, it can't just be as you put it, marginally better. It has to be something we haven't conceived of.
But it's the depth of the suffering that makes that payoff,
right?
Is it not?
It has to be. At least that's how it works in art, right? When you watch a great show or listen to a great symphony or whatever, it has to resolve in a certain way to really be satisfying. And we all know when it doesn't land right, and it has to justify everything that came before it. And so the power of the evidential problem of evil is that it is impossible to imagine a justification, a resolution that justifies all this. I think it's impossible. I can't do it. Yeah, that's part of the power of the view. Stacked up against some of the most brilliant thinkers to have thought about this and brought up really, really interesting solutions, or not solutions, but at least
theories,
paths to some kind of satisfactory answer. For my money, none of them are sufficient, and stringing them together and making an interesting hybrid, I think, is a worthwhile endeavor, and I'm glad people do it. But again, for my money, none of them quite do it.
Is that primarily because you are a materialist?
I don't think so. I'm sure it's probably related in a way that I haven't thought carefully enough about, but no, I think this problem stands regardless of that.
Okay.
I don't think believing in an immaterial soul, for example, would help that much.
Yeah, I only ask you if you hold that position because you're a materialist, because you are very much focused on what is not, when we talk about spiritual things, or when we talk about possible miracles, or when we talk about supernatural phenomena, you think it's best for us to be skeptical instantly. That should be our first and most foundational orientation to any supernatural activity is skepticism. Would you agree with that?
I tend that direction. That's fair. I don't want to say make a kind of normative claim about anybody's,
Right.
I don't want to say it's unreasonable for anybody to believe in something like that, but yeah.
Even though you would say you've experienced the supernatural in some ways.
I think I've experienced God, which I guess by definition is
So yes.
in some sense
Yeah.
supernatural.
Yeah.
I don't think I have good evidence for any miracles.
Yeah. So I think where we can leave it in this first part is there are some really convincing reasons not to believe in God.
Yeah, and some really clever and thoughtful responses. And we haven't gone
And I
through
think
all of them, right?
I think
There are
even more than clever and thoughtful.
Yeah,
I think serious.
they're sophisticated. They're
Yes.
serious. They're people who have spent their whole lives developing them. Really brilliant and careful people who took suffering extremely seriously. Still people who specialize in that. And some of them we haven't even encountered yet, but I think we've probably reached a point where I said at the beginning, we're going to get as far as we get. So maybe we should make this a part 2 and go into some more of those, because there are some interesting takes on the problem of evil that I wouldn't even call a theodicy, actually, but they are a response in a certain way. And I want to give them their due.
Yeah. So let's look forward to, listeners. We'll just let you mull on this. We'll let you pray about it. And stay tuned for the end of the conversation about theodicy and the problem of evil.
Also, now above our Pappy level of Patreon support is the Discover the Answer to Evil level, in which Kyle tells you
that's a 6-figure level of support.
Yeah, you're gonna have to pony up, buddy.
Yeah, I wish.